welcome into the program. Great to be with you this morning. Glad to be back from vacation. I got to tell you, I had a lot of fun over Christmas and Festivus and everything else that was going on. Glad to be with you. Hope that you had a great time with your family. I know a lot of you are back at work, are back to the grind, and we certainly appreciate everything you do. And before we go any further, I do want to say another thank you to those of you who did work on Christmas. So we're talking about EMTs, paramedics, nurses, doctors, firefighters, police officers, all the people out there that were working really, really hard over the holiday to make sure that everybody was safe and could enjoy the time with their family by being away from yours. We really do thank you. Thank you to our first responders that do that and that work so very, very hard, including over the holidays, that are always on call 24 hours a day, that work really hard to make sure that our cities and towns are safe and that we can be safe and enjoy our holidays with our families. Thank you to those of you who have done that. Now that we are back from the holiday, Carlos Chavez Jr. is back in the news yet again. For those of you who may not remember, he happens to be the guy that's kind of the unofficial ringleader for the protests that are going on in Hoover. The guy is somebody who's an activist. He's been trained by liberals out of D.C., very active in the political sphere, and he has said things like encouraging violence against police officers, trying to shut down the mall, trying to shut down the city of Hoover. He has also said, just some ridiculous, crazy things about not only calling for violence, but acting as though he actually knows what happened on Thanksgiving, on Black Friday. Thanksgiving night, Black Friday sales. When a police officer in the city of Hoover actually shot somebody who apparently was armed at the time. We don't know the details, haven't seen the video, which, by the way, I'm still very much concerned about. But nonetheless, whether I'm concerned about it or not, even though we don't know the story, whether it was justified or not, some of the things that this guy has said have made absolutely no sense whatsoever. But the latest in the news is that Carlos Chavez Jr., has been banned from the Galleria for 1 year. So if he should set foot on Galleria property before December 15th, 2019, he is under the threat of arrest. So they've already notified him. So if he walks on to the Galleria, if he parks in the parking lot, then he will be subject to arrest based on the Galleria, which he has, of course, responded to this. He's very upset about this whole thing because it means if he tries to lead a protest, if he tries to lead it onto the Galleria's property, then he does face the possibility of being arrested for doing so. And he wrote this on Facebook. These types of actions aren't constitutional, and we will vigorously fight for the unfair discriminatory practices of both the Galleria and the Hoover police. All right, well, as normal, this guy seems to really not have any idea what he's talking about, just like he has throughout this entire time that he's been doing the protest, referring to police officers as Klansmen and white supremacists, even, oddly enough, some black police officers that he's said that were members of the Klan because they happen to be police officers. So, look, the guy's a crazy person, but let's actually deal with the issue at hand. He's saying that it's unconstitutional. Look, I've read the Constitution quite a bit. I'm a pretty big fanboy of the Constitution, and even people that I don't agree with, when their constitutional rights are being violated, I tend to stick up for them. I think that anybody that's been a fan of this program for any length of time would tell you that that is the case. But I'm looking at this right now, and I don't see how in any way this is a constitutional violation. Now, if it were a government building, even then, I think it wouldn't necessarily be a violation of the Constitution, but at least then he would have something of a case. For example, if they said to this guy, the police force, well, you can't assemble on police property, on city property, you can't come together with protesters and protest us, then I see where he's coming from. I don't necessarily agree with him, but I see where he's coming from. If someone were to do that and he were causing a problem and it always ended in riots and unlawful practices, okay, well then I think that the police force and the people that own the police building have a case to kind of go on, saying that this guy can't be trusted with that if he's broken the law multiple times. But we're not even dealing with city property. We are dealing with private property, which creates just a completely different dynamic than what we're talking about here. Because since we are dealing with private property owned by a private business, in this case the Galleria Mall, there's really absolutely no case whatsoever that you can make for this being a constitutional violation. And this is one of the things that I try to inform people about when they're talking about the constitutionality of something. The Constitution can only be violated by the government. Only the government can violate the Constitution. A private entity never can. For example, no matter how hard you try, you cannot violate the First Amendment if you're a private citizen. You can say, my religion is wrong. You can say, my religion is stupid. You can say, my religion is of the devil. You can say all of those things. You're still not violating my freedom to practice my religion because you do not have the force of law backing you up. The same could be said of freedom of speech, freedom of assembly. You could go into other amendments. You could go into the Second Amendment. You can think me owning a gun is a bad idea and irresponsible, but unless you have the force of law to actually try to take my firearm away from me, you're not actually violating the Second Amendment. And so when you're dealing with issues of constitutionality, it is not even humanly possible for the Galleria to violate the Constitution, even if they really, really wanted to. If they set their mind on, we need to figure out a way to violate the Constitution today, wouldn't matter what they come up with, unless they get the government involved, they can't do it. Unless they have the force of law behind them, they can't do it. And this is their private property. Throwing an individual citizen off of private property that's causing problems or impeding business is perfectly reasonable. I say this as somebody who has worked security many a time. And if you are operating and you are working for a business and you're working security, and there is someone that they deem as a problem for their business, it's not that uncommon to kick that person out. That's why bars have bouncers. If you are a belligerent drunk inside a bar and you're causing problems for other people inside the bar, in other words, you're impeding business or causing problems that could negatively affect the business, that's why they have a bouncer. The bouncer comes in and he kicks you out. That's how it works. And this is no different than what is being done to Carlos Chavez Jr. This guy has specifically and publicly stated that it is his goal to shut down the mall. Why is it unreasonable for that mall to not want him to be allowed on property? Look, they can't control what this man says. Even though it makes absolutely no logical sense whatsoever to go after the mall had nothing to do with the shooting. All the mall did was see that people were being shot at, call the police officers, the police show up. What the police do there is not their fault. Even if you believe that the police officer in question, and again, we don't know that because we haven't seen the footage, we haven't heard testimony that backs this up. Even if you believe the police officer is absolutely 100% as guilty as sin, it still makes absolutely no sense to go after the mall. The mall had nothing to do with what was going on here. And so that absolutely blows my mind that they're even wanting to go after the mall. But nonetheless, whether it makes sense or not, they do. Whether it makes sense that they want to go after the mall at this point or not, they do. They've publicly stated they want to shut down the mall. They've chanted as they're going through their protest, shut it down, shut down the Galleria. And so it makes sense that the mall sees this person that is causing an uproar, causing problems, trying to impede their business, saying, nope, this guy's not allowed on property anymore. That's perfectly reasonable. I've worked security where I've had to throw people out. I've done that when there was a person that was being disruptive, that was hurting business. I've done that. I've been that guy before. It's not that uncommon. And when you are actively trying to stop that business, disturb the other customers, or interrupt business in any other way, it's perfectly reasonable to want to do so. Heck, if you happen to be in a bar in Auburn and you see a guy with an Alabama hat walk in and say, we need to throw that guy out, or vice versa. Is it a little petty? Sure. But legally speaking, you're a private business. You have the right to do that. I mean, if they want to, that's up to them. Now, they could give the excuse of, well, we don't want a bunch of Auburn fans in here turning away because the guy has an Alabama hat on. Now, is that a reasonable explanation? No. But they can come up with the explanation. But the truth is, they don't even really need it. You have a right to, as a private business owner, refuse service to whomever you desire. If you just don't like the guy's face, you can kick that guy out. That's what it means to have private property in this country. For the same way that if there's someone in your house that you do not want there, and you tell them to leave and they refuse to leave, you have the right to call the police on them and have them arrested for trespassing. That's the way private property works. And so actually, saying that the mall would be unable to ban him would be closer to be a violation of the law and a violation of at least the principles behind the Constitution. Like I said, a private citizen can't violate the Constitution, but it would at least be closer to violating the principles of the Constitution to say to a private business owner, nope, you have to have that person allowed in your business. You have to have that person to come in. You have to have that person. You have to serve them in some way. Or even if you don't serve them, you have to have them, they are allowed to be here. No, you having private property, even if that private property, generally speaking, is available to the public, that does not make you no longer have those property rights. And as I've said 1,000 times, private property, the definition of property is that which you are allowed to deny access to. If I have a car, but anytime I want to, somebody can just come by and joyride in it and ride around and use it for their own purposes, then it's not really my car. If I own a house, but anytime that anyone wants to, they can walk into my house and take a nap or sleep there for the night, then it's not really my house because I do not have the ability to deny access to other people. That's what it means to have private property. And so what Chavez Jr. and the other protesters are suggesting, that it's somehow wrong for the Galleria to not be able to allow this person access to their property and their facilities. No, that would actually be a violation of property rights if they did not have the ability to deny that person access to it. That's what it means to be a property owner in this state or in this country. And I just, for the life of me, I can't figure out why they want to punish them all in the first place. I don't get the logic, and I get I'm looking for logic in a logical vacuum. I understand I'm not going to find it. These people are operating off of emotion. They're operating off of their feelings, and because of that, they're not making rational, logical decisions. But I don't, for the life of me, understand why they're going after the mall of all things. Because like I said, we don't know exactly what happened, what went down on Thanksgiving night between Bradford and the police officer. But regardless of what happened there is no scenario where the mall was at fault. There is no scenario where the mall is the one being held responsible for the events that unfolded there that night. And so I just do not get the mentality that somehow we're going to punish them all for this. But nonetheless, as little sense as that makes, I do want to move on to something else. I do want you to pray for Ruth Bader Ginsburg. We just got word today that she has been released from the hospital. She had 2 cancerous nodes removed. Her doctors, thankfully, have said that there is no sign of cancer anywhere else in her body. Now, when it comes to Ruth Bader Ginsburg, I think that she is probably the second worst justice on the Supreme Court. I would say Sonia Sotomayor is a little bit worse, because at least sometimes when Ruth Bader Ginsburg sees a ruling she doesn't like, she does at least kind of try to cobble together a legal rationale for the reason she arrived at her conclusion. Sotomayor basically is just like, nope, I think it should be this way, and that's why I'm going to say that. Doesn't even really take any consideration for, how do I make this sound right legally? Sotomayor is just like, nope, I think it should be this way, so I'm going to make it that way. So I think Sotomayor is actually a little bit worse, but nonetheless, Ruth Bader Ginsburg is not somebody that I agree with. In fact, I think that the country would be far, far better off if Ruth Bader Ginsburg were no longer on the court, but I do not want her death to be the way that it comes about that way. I would much rather her retire or be impeached or something. But when it comes to Ruth Bader Ginsburg, I do not wish any ill will towards her. In fact, I'm asking everybody to pray for her right now. I hope that she makes a good recovery, and especially somebody that is dealing with everything that she has, with falling recently and her ribs being fractured and then having these cancerous nodes removed. I mean, it is just really, really sad that she's in such failing health, and just like I would for anybody that is dealing with these health complications, I do ask that everybody pray for Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And the Trump shutdown is the big news story of the day, so we're going to get into that. The shutdown is still going to continue. And again, I referred to it as the Trump shutdown, but as I've said, I don't know how many times on this program, it is always important to remember that it takes 2 sides of the government to shut it down. That was true when Ted Cruz was the ringleader of the whole thing in 2013. It's true when the Democrats had their desires to shut it down over the DACA recipients earlier this year with Chuck Schumer. regardless of what happens or who kind of initiates the shutdown, at the end of the day, it still takes both sides to shut it down. Because there was always the option that one side, whether you think they should or should not, can capitulate to the other side and say, you know what, we're not going to keep government shut down. We're going to go ahead and give you whatever you want. So regardless of who started the shutdown or how it worked, when you're looking at a shutdown, it is always a two-party, in this case, and the way our country is run right now, it is always both parties that is involved in shutting the government down. So I don't think playing the blame game is very productive. I don't think that it's very useful, and it certainly doesn't help us get to where we need to be when it comes to policy. But as I've said, I don't know how many times, I'm not really all that worried about the shutdown, especially considering this is barely a shutdown. First of all, we already have the Department of Defense funded, so like 80% of the people that normally work for the federal government are working anyway, and the only employees that are not working right now are what are referred to as non-essential personnel, which, frankly, the fact that we have non-essential personnel is offensive to me in the first place. Anywhere in private business, if you had something that was a non-essential employee, that person would be a non-employee. There's just not another nicer way to say it. If you are operating within the confines of private business to where you have to meet a budget and you're spending your own money as opposed to other people's money, there would be no such thing as a non-essential employee. If they were, you'd figure out a way to get around it. You'd figure out a way for their work to be done in another place. Because work that is non-essential is work that does not get done in the private sector. But nonetheless, there was a video conference that our commander-in-chief engaged with troops on Christmas Day, which this is pretty common. Most presidents do this. So Trump said in this particular video call, I can't tell you when the government is going to reopen. I can tell you I'm not going to reopen it until we have a wall, a fence, whatever they'd like to call it. I'll call it whatever they want, but it's all the same thing. It's a barrier from people pouring into the country from drugs. If you don't have that, then we're just not opening. Now, here's the thing. This is the issue that got Trump elected. Or at the very least, it was something that the people that voted for him in the Electoral College didn't mind. So maybe you voted for Trump for something else. Maybe you voted for Trump because you were worried about the Supreme Court and the justices that were going to be appointed. Nonetheless, you still thought that this was an issue that he was at least right enough on that it wasn't a deal breaker for you voting for him. And so that's one thing. And because of this is really the reason that Trump is in office right now. And he knows it is go time. This is make or break. And because this is make or break, because this is the thing that he promised, that he ran on, he knows he's got to get this done, and he knows that his time is quickly expiring because the House will soon be under the control of the Democrats. And so because of this, I got to be honest, I think that he probably winds up getting a boost in his approval rating. Because even people that are kind of iffy and wishy-washy on the border, they still respect somebody that sticks to his guns. And it made Trump come off as ridiculously weak when he would say, well, we need 20 billion for the border. And then he whittled that down to about 5 billion. And then the Democrat said nothing. He's like, okay, well, I'll just sign the continuing resolution anyway. That was not a good look for the president. And I'm not all about, optics and just playing the political games. I get that. And you guys know that that's what I'm about. But this is something that I think actually might help him in the approval ratings because people do respect somebody that takes charge and sticks to their guns and does what they're going to say. And so it's going to help him with his base, but I actually think it winds up helping him with the moderates. I think it actually winds up helping him with that middle that is kind of looking at Trump as somebody who talked really big but didn't get a whole lot done because he promised on repealing Obamacare. We know that didn't happen. He promised to get the budget under control. And while we've definitely cut back on things like regulation, the budget is on pace to be double what Obama was when he left office. So we're looking at a national debt that is going to continue to just compound upon itself and spending in the government that is going to be double what Obama was spending when he left office if Trump continues down this path and gets 8 years. And so because of that, basically Trump has failed to deliver on any of his promises, but if he gets the border wall, that's something that he can at least point to and say, see, this is why you elected me. And that's why it's instrumental, and I think that Trump understands this after seeing Ann Coulter, a woman that literally wrote a book called In Trump We Trust. putting Trump in the place of God, which nobody should ever do. And I've never been a huge Ann Coulter fan, but having her say during this whole debate, you know what? If he doesn't get the border wall built, I'm not voting for him again. When you've got somebody that is that much of a sycophant, if you've got somebody that is that loyal to you, say, you know what? Just not voting for him this next time around if he doesn't get that done. That's got to make you sit down and take a minute and think, yeah, maybe need to reevaluate that, because if somebody like that can't vote for me in the next time, how many other Americans are going to follow suit? And so because of that, I do think that the president had to sit back and consider that. But nonetheless, this is why Trump got elected, and I think that the timing on the holidays might actually wind up helping him. And here's what I mean by that. This could minimize the blame on Trump, because regardless of what happens now, Trump is going to get the blame for the shutdown. Like I was just saying, I get that it takes two parties to shut the government down. It always does. Every time it happens, without exception, it's always both parties' fault. But when it comes to this one, Trump has already said in that big meeting, you remember, with Pelosi and Schumer that was on national TV, you know what? I'm going to take the blame for it. I'm going to put that on me because it's this important. Look, I agreed with him, and I think it's 100% worth it. 100% worth it to shut the government down and to own that. But there are going to be people in the middle that don't. However, the fact that it's happening over the Christmas break, a lot of that mushy middle that doesn't really pay a whole lot of attention to news, that really doesn't zero in on news like a lot of the people that are listening right now probably do, those people are going to be less likely to blame Trump for it, even though he said he'd take ownership of it, specifically because it's Christmas. Nobody, unless you're an actual federal employee, is paying really close attention to this. So unless you're just a news geek like me and like a lot of y'all, or you are an actual federal employee, you're just not paying that much attention to it. This weekend, actually yesterday, Christmas, sitting around with the family, my dad happens to mention that the government is shut down. And my sister goes, the government shut down? Now, my sister is an incredibly bright, intelligent young woman. I mean, one of the smartest people I know, but she doesn't keep up with the news. And the reason that I use her as a pretty good gauge for how much people are paying attention is because she's like most Americans. Doesn't really pay a whole lot of attention to the news. She'll catch something here or there, but by and large, especially if it's something where she's got a lot going on like Christmas, people right now are worried about being able to see their family, get the presents for their kids, make sure Santa came and everything like that. They're just not worried about the government shutdown. Like I said, my sister didn't even know it was shut down. And you know what? Neither did my aunt. And so this idea that people are going to blame Trump and this is going to really hurt him in the next election, I just don't buy it. Even if people that pay attention to the news do wind up blaming Trump for the election, I just don't think that that accusation is going to stick very well. Now, the timing could also minimize the credit to Trump in the Republican base. That's also something to consider. Because a lot of people are not really paying attention, he's not going to get the credit for the shutdown that he should get if this whole thing winds up working and he actually winds up getting $5 billion for the border wall. Because of that, and because people aren't zeroing in on the news right now, he's going to get less credit from the Republican base to a degree. But you have to keep in mind that studies have shown, Pew Research especially, that people that tend to vote Republican tend to watch more news and tend to study more for elections than other people, which means it might hurt him with his base a little bit that the timing is at a place where people aren't really paying attention to the news. But to be honest, it's far more likely that that would happen with a Democrat president than a Republican president. Because if you tend to have voters in your base that are more liberal, they tend to pay attention to the news less. Because Republicans, just as a general rule, tend to pay attention to the news a little bit more, then you're actually going to have less damage, or I should say, you're going to have less of that effect where people are not giving Trump the credit if this happens to work out. That's going to be lessened to a degree. So because of that, that is going to make a difference, I believe. I think what's most likely to happen is you're going to have a little bit of both. And what's very likely is that this whole thing is going to pass largely unnoticed. You know, we get to sit here and nitpick and try to look into our crystal balls and figure out exactly how this is going to play out and how it's going to affect the politics. But to be honest, this is just my experience as somebody who's been following news for a very long time. Because of the timing of this, because it's happening over the Christmas holiday, where people are really more focused on their family and focused on the holidays themselves, I think what's going to happen is this is going to be largely unnoticed. That most people are just going to not even pick up on the fact that there is a government shutdown, or if they are, because it's not right in front of them all the time, they're really not going to notice the effects of it. And because of that, I think that it's not even going to cause that effect of, oh, we don't really need the government because they've been shut down by several days and nobody noticed. I think what's actually going to happen is that people will just be largely apathetic about it. The people are going to largely just not even know that it's going on, and therefore it's not going to make a big difference. That would be my prediction of how this whole thing is going to walk. However, this could start to backfire. And I'm just looking at the possibilities at this point. I don't know that this is going to happen. I'm not saying that this is likely to happen. I'm just saying these are some possibilities. This is why I thought that waiting too long, in my opinion, was a pretty stupid idea. This is a fight we should have been having about 2 years ago. Because now what we're doing is we're also facing down the clock. It was one thing when all we had to do was face down the Democrats when we had a Republican-controlled Congress, both in the House and the Senate, and a Republican president. Now what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to run out the clock, and the Democrats know that they can run out the clock on us. So because of that, I do think that what we're running into, and part of the problem we have here, is the Democrats don't really want to negotiate because they know all they have to do is run out the clock on us and wait a little bit longer, and then they're going to have control of the House. Now, granted, that also means they have an even smaller minority in the Senate, but if they have the House, if they've got one branch of Congress, their bargaining chips are actually a lot better. Their position is much improved if they have the House that they can kind of hold over everybody else. And if they do that, if that is going to be their plan, if that is their design, and I think that it is, they know all they've got to do is wait until the new Congress is sworn in. And that's not that long. This is why I said we should have been having this fight either earlier this year or 2 years ago. We need to go ahead and then have a Republican House draw up a budget that included funding for the wall and have it passed by the Senate, signed by the president. Now, because we've waited until the very tail end to actually get serious about this and put it on the front burner, as it were, because we've waited so long on that, the Democrats know they have the option of just running out the clock on us. And so this is one of the reasons that I thought it was a really bad idea, because now you're facing down really two enemies. And the Democrat base is going to be ticked when the government is shut down. The Republican base barely notices. They barely notice, to be honest, because what you're looking at when you're talking about people that tend to vote Democrat, a lot of federal employees are Democrats, save the military, which tends to lean more Republican. Right now they're funded anyway, so that really doesn't make much difference. But if you're looking at the voting bases, the reason that government shutdowns matter way more to Democrats and the reason they take way more flack for it with their base than the Republicans do with theirs is because you have to look at the demographics of the voting bases themselves. So if you're looking at the Democrats, you've got an awful lot of people that don't pay taxes, that rely on government for their welfare, their food stamps, whatever. They depend on the government for an awful lot. And they tend to be people of minority status. Usually. There's a lot of minorities that vote Democrats. I get that there's a lot of white people that do too. But if you're looking at those three categories, those tend to be the people that vote Democrat more often. And because of that, and because they rely on government more and they have a more favorable view of government policies and government actions, they're the ones that really get upset when the government is shut down. You look at the Republican base, it tends to be predominantly people that are more independent. People that either own businesses, work in the private sector, all of those things. And so because of that, Republicans really don't care all that much when the government shuts down. I mean, they'd rather it not to a degree. I mean, I'm a libertarian, so, or I at least kind of lean libertarian, and so because of that, I don't really care much whether the government shuts down or not. But even if you're looking at moderate to somewhat conservative Republicans, you're still running into this idea that we tend to be more independently minded, and the government shutting down really doesn't affect our day-to-day lives all that much. We're not worried about a Social Security check, even though those are funded and those are going to go out. We're not worried about welfare, even though that's actually funded and that's going out. Those things are not really a big concern to us, and so a government shutdown just really isn't all that scary to people that are more on the right side. And that's why this is going to play out, I think, probably in Trump's favor. I think that because he waited so long, it could backfire, but I think that is going to probably not happen. Unfortunately, though, this is why waiting out the Democrats basically any other time would have been perfectly good and been a fine strategy. Now the fact that the Democrats are going to be taking the House makes that a little less of a winning strategy, because even if, let's say, the Democrats do run out the clock, they take the House, and they put a budget on there without funding for the border wall, Trump could still say theoretically, you know what, I'm not going to do it, I'm not going to sign it, you guys give me funding for the border wall, and let's say Trump gets everything that he wants. I still think that he's actually going to get less funding for the border wall if it's a Democrat House. And so because of that, even if he doesn't get the deal that he wants per se, he's going to get maybe a deal if he tries to, or if he insists on not opening up the government until they get funding for a wall, but he's still not going to get as good a deal as he has right now on the floor of the Republican House, which is why the Senate needs to get off their sorry tail, get this thing passed, and get it to the president's desk right now. That's what needs to happen. And if they can do that, then it'll all be okay. But if the Democrats try to run out the clock on us, even if they don't get everything they want, they're going to get a better deal than they are if this bill that was passed by the House winds up on the president's desk. And they know that, and that's why they are trying so desperately to stall. And they're probably going to be able to do it because they would need a 60-vote majority in the Senate for that to work. So that being said, I think that Trump still wins if he doesn't cave, but if the Democrats hold out for a better deal, he doesn't win as much. Now, before we move on from the shutdown, I do want to say this. I know that this is going to be a big surprise to you, but I actually agree with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Now, I know your mouth is wide open. It just hit the floor. No. I know. She says 90% of the crap that comes out of her mouth is completely stupid. I mean, detached from reality, completely unconstitutional, just crazy stuff comes out of her all the time. She's been a constant target of the Daily Dose of Stupid. But this time, she's not the Daily Dose of Stupid. In fact, I think I agree with everything in this statement, weirdly enough. So here is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, a tweet she sent out earlier this week. Next time we have a government shutdown, congressional salaries should be furlonged as well. It's completely unacceptable that members of Congress can force a government shutdown on partisan lines and then have congressional salaries exempt from that decision. Have some integrity. I gotta hand it to her. I think she's right on that. In fact, I had this idea back in 2013. That was something that I suggested back then. So, not necessarily an original idea. It was one that I came up with first, although I doubt that she got it from me. I don't know, maybe she watches this. I'm not sure. Kind of doubt it. But nonetheless, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, because if she watched the show, she'd be better informed. But Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez coming up with an idea that I 100% agree with. It doesn't make any sense to me that in a government shutdown, Congress still gets their salary. Somehow that's exempt when there are other people that have their salaries either put off for a while, or when you're the one that's causing the shutdown, you ought to be the first people that don't see your paycheck. And when it comes to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, I'm guessing that she and I view government very differently. Well, I know she and I view government very differently and view government shutdowns very differently. I don't see them as necessarily the end of the world or a bad thing. But nonetheless, one thing that even she and I, a democratic socialist and a conservatarian, as it were, can come together and shake hands and agree on, there is absolutely no reason why Congress should be continuing to get their salaries in government shutdowns, especially considering in a lot of government shutdowns, not this one, but in several previous government shutdowns, our brave men and women risking their lives on the battlefield were not paid, while our Congress members were. That is a complete lack of like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez just said, a complete lack of integrity. And she's 100% right on that. So, that being said, just remember that when we're talking about this, when we're talking about the shutdown, none of it would happen if Congress did their job and passed an annual budget. We are now, 10 years away from the last budget that was passed? I think maybe 11, actually. I think it may be 11. Anyway, regardless of when it was, been at least a decade since Congress last passed an actual budget the way that they were supposed to. And that's why we're in this situation. That's why we constantly have the shutdown fight over continuing resolutions. And so just remember, the only reason we are having this problem, that we are in this fight to begin with, is because both Republican and Democrat controlled houses have refused to put forward an actual budget. They continue to want to pass these continuing resolutions over and over again and fund the government a few months at a time so we can have this fight over and over again. Pass a freaking budget. It's one of the most basic things that you're required to do. And if we did that, we wouldn't be having this discussion in the first place. Really tragic news today, and I did, before we do anything else, want to encourage everybody to pray for the family affected by this, because regardless of the circumstances, regardless of whether or not you like the parents or whatever, anytime a child dies, it is, of course, a tragedy. And unfortunately, we have lost the life of another child that has died in the custody of U.S. Customs today. And there was a small Guatemalan boy named Felipe Gomez Alonso. Sorry, I'm having trouble talking today for whatever reason. Felipe Gomez Alonso. And what happened with him is that he was showing signs of illness on Monday, starting to feel a little bit sick. They became concerned, and because of that, they sent him to a hospital. He was diagnosed with a cold and a fever. They gave him medicine, and then they held him for observation for about 90 minutes, according to reports that we're seeing, and then he was released. So it looked like it was going to be just a routine thing. They held him for observation, didn't see any reason to be concerned. He had a cold and a fever. You know, you don't typically worry about that with kids. And then at 7 p.m., he started showing signs of illness again. The father, who was there with him, he apparently crossed the border with his 8-year-old Guatemalan son. They talked to him, and he said, no, he's good. No reason to worry. He doesn't need any more medical care or whatever. And then about 10 p.m., he had gotten much worse, and so they readmitted him back to the hospital. And he was vomiting and then died a little bit after midnight. So for 2 hours, they fought to save this kid's life, and I don't know what exactly it was. I guess they had the cold and fever, and then they had the vomiting. Who knows exactly what happened? Who knows exactly what it is? Right now, we don't really understand what condition he was in or why. Those details haven't come out. According to a story that was done by the AP, we don't have a lot about his condition or how he arrived or anything like that. So, unfortunately, this has taken place, and even though they were trying to save his life, it doesn't look like they were able to pull that off. So, continue to pray for the boy's family. And one thing that has happened as a result of this is that U.S. Customs has now implemented a new policy for the time being, that every new child that comes through is going to have to undergo medical screening. So instead of just taking the parent's word for it or requesting, as we know was the process we learned from the last story, requesting that the parents, if they have any medical need, asking them if the parents say no, instead of just taking their word for it, they're actually going to go in and actually treat the patient, or at least observe them and see if there is anything that they need done for them before just asking the parent and just taking their, basically on their word, that their child doesn't need any kind of medical attention. This I actually think is a really good thing. Because while I totally understand and don't blame border security for what has happened thus far with the death of either of these two children that have been in the news recently, I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing to undergo medical screenings for these kids. Now, as a fiscal conservative, I do worry about the cost, and thinking about how many children come across, undergoing a medical screening is going to bump up the cost some. But if I am understanding this correctly, if you are an unaccompanied minor, in other words, you come across and you don't have your parents, well, then you undergo a medical screening anyway. And so this would only specifically pertain to children that cross with their parents, and they get a medical examination upon being received or being captured. So, I think that there are certain disadvantages to it when it comes to the cost, but overall it's probably a good idea. And keep in mind that when we're talking about the constitutionality of this, when it comes to border security and making sure that our nation is safe from invasion, that actually is a legitimate function of the federal government. And so while these medical screenings may or may not be overly expensive, and I don't know if they will be or not, I imagine the cost won't be too terribly high. At least this is something that is within the realm, within the purview of something that the Constitution specifically recommends that our country do. So understanding that, I do think that this is probably a good idea, especially considering that we've had problems with this in the past. And just because you support this idea doesn't mean you are against border control or think that border control did something wrong. If anything, it's an indication that Border Patrol is desiring to do more and to step up their game and do even more for the people that come into their custody above and beyond what they are legally required to do, because they see this as a real problem. Now, in the interviews that were done by the Associated Press and other news outlets, they said this is an exceedingly rare event. They don't often have children just die in their custody. And I also do not think that it is fair to blame border security for getting custody of a child for who knows how long. I think that this particular one was obtained on December 20. The illness happened on Monday, so that would have been Christmas Eve, but I believe they were actually picked up on December 18th. And so it's really not fair to second guess customs, because just because a child dies in their custody does not mean there was anything they could do. For example, you don't blame the doctor if somebody has some kind of illness and the doctor does everything he can but still can't save them. And so the same standard needs to be applied to Border Patrol. Just because somebody dies in their custody does not mean they were not working to help them. Now, that's the narrative that the left would like to perpetuate, and that's the narrative that they're going to continue to run with, because they want to do everything in their power to make Border Patrol look bad and look like a bunch of heartless, evil monsters. I don't think it's going to work with the American people, but that is the narrative that they've been pushing. That original story from the Washington Post, I mean, you could tell from beginning to end that entire story was designed and structured in such a way to make Border Patrol look as bad as humanly possible. And this story really isn't any different. The way that it came out, the way it's being reported, and that is going to be the conversation as it goes forward, is that they're going to continue to push this narrative that, well, if you're in Border Patrol, if you're in ICE, if you're in Customs, you really just don't care about immigrant children. That is going to be what they're pushing forward. And unfortunately, even though I think this is the right thing to do, and regardless of what the political fallout is going to be for this, then the U.S. Customs should do it. Regardless of all of that, what you are going to see is you're going to see, they weren't doing these medical screenings before. That's because they didn't care about children, and they're only doing it now. They're only doing it now because they got caught and because children are dying under their watch. Look, the fact that something becomes news usually means that it's uncommon. Not all the time. Sometimes you just find something that has been going on for a while and report on it. But typically speaking, if something is in the news, it is in the news because it's rare. Because things that are commonplace don't wind up in the news typically. Again, maybe there's some exceptions, but by and large, if you're seeing something in the news, it's an anomaly. And these are rare events. Children do die in the custom of when they are under the custody of Customs or ICE or Border Patrol or whatever, but it doesn't happen all that often, which is part of the reason that it's making news now. That, and the media has an agenda to try to stop the Border Patrol. And what I mean by that is, do you really believe that the Washington Post or the New York Times or the Associated Press would be reporting on all these stories if they were happening under the watchful eye of Barack Obama? No, you would not. How do we know this? Well, for one, there are a ton of publications that ran with this idea of family separation only after Obama left office, even though it was a policy that was happening under his watch, under his administration. We saw photos of car seat buses and children in cages, all of which were taken during the Obama administration, and put out there as though they happened under the eye of the Trump administration. There was a case about abuse that happened with the detention facility for illegal minors in Virginia that became big national news. Only they forgot to mention until, like, I don't know, paragraph 15 in that article, oh, and by the way, this was happening in 2015. This was happening under Barack Obama's administration. They forgot to mention that. And though they mentioned the year, they mentioned Donald Trump, I think 7 times, if I'm not mistaken, didn't mention Obama's name not once. Even though Trump wasn't in office when it was happening. And so this is the game that they play, and this is why people get so frustrated with it. These, stories about these children dying in the custody of our Border Patrol or Customs, they are tragic, absolutely. But the problem is, they are not something that are necessarily uncommon or that are only exclusively happening in the Trump administration. And everybody that's an honest broker will tell you that we would not be seeing these stories come about and become national headlines if Barack Obama were in charge of the federal government still. And the second big thing is that just because they die in the custody of our Border Patrol or ICE does not mean that they did anything wrong. Sometimes you can do absolutely everything you can to save someone's life, and it just doesn't happen. We're not gods. We can't stop death. And so because of that, you may have a kid that is severely ill, severely dehydrated, that's been roaming across the desert for weeks on end, and then you get them in their custody and they happen to die 10 minutes after you get a hold of them, and all of a sudden it's your fault. Is this really the game that we want to play with the media every single time? Because I do think that it's newsworthy, and I do think it's tragic that this boy died. However, is the game that we're going to play with the media every single time that now, every time a child dies in the custody of Border Patrol, it's going to make national headlines, and we're going to say, see, this is proof. This is proof that Customs are a bunch of evil, heartless, racist monsters. Because I'm not willing to play that game. I don't believe that about our Border Patrol. I don't believe that about, and you can say it's so transparent that that is exactly what they're trying to do. Because I don't think any honest person believes that no child in the custody of Customs or Border Patrol, no child ever died when it was Barack Obama in office. You're a moron if you believe that. The reason it's getting pressed now is because they see this as an opportunity to go after Trump. And if you don't believe me, let's take a look at the broader picture here. Let's look at illegal immigration as a whole. How many children are hurt by the drug trade that is going on and allowed to go on because we have open borders? How many children are hurt by sex trafficking, which is incredibly abundant on the southern border, and part of the reason that the policy of child separation has been useful to an extent, because we have so much child sex trafficking on the border. I've talked to people that have actually done sting operations freeing these kids. Not only is it a problem, it happens a lot more than you think. There are more sex slaves in the world right now than the entire 400-year history of the Western slave trade combined. That's how many sex slaves are in the world right now. Now, granted, that's not all on the U.S.-Mexico border, but that is the number one entry point for child sex trafficking in the United States. And so, why aren't they concerned about those kids? Because I'm concerned about both. I'm concerned about the kids that are dying once they're in custody of Customs, but I'm also concerned about the kids that die before they ever get to Customs, that die on the journey over here. And I'm also concerned about the kids that die here because they are drawn here by Democrat policies like sanctuary cities, welfare, free education, free healthcare, which, by the way, Hillary Clinton ran on, giving illegal immigrants the ability to obtain healthcare through Obamacare. So all of those things that draw people in, that draw in illegal immigrants and draw in their families and give them incentive to come across with their family, including the fact that they're less likely to be arrested and deported if they have a kid with them. When you take into consideration all of those things, those are the things that are endangering kids, and neither this little boy nor this little girl, if we had a robust, secure border that kept people from trying to sneak across, we wouldn't have these problems in the first place. If it were not for Democrat policies like sanctuary cities, like all these welfare programs, the truth is both of these children would probably still be alive today. And that's the ugly truth that the Democrats do not want to talk about and do not want to face. And as horrible as it is, that tends to be where the conversation really needs to go. And the easiest solution to this is to just not entice illegals to come over here in the first place. Hence, the shutdown. What's ironic about this is, when we're looking at the news right now, there is one side that is promoting lawlessness, that is promoting these policies that would continue to incentivize bringing these kids over, putting them in harm's way to do so. And yet that's the same one that are saying, we're willing to allow the government to shut down to make sure there are not physical barriers between us and the other country that would discourage people from other nations from coming over here. It's absolutely insane. The same ones that are crying about this and saying that the Border Patrol are the ones that are causing these problems are the ones that are continuing to push policies that convince people to come over here and to try to do everything they can to make sure that border is open so they can come over here. That's what's so horrible about this whole thing. The same people that are causing the problem are the ones that are pointing their finger and waggling it at other people just trying to solve the issue. Because if we had robust border security, that would make it safer for everybody, including these kids that are being brought over here through no fault of their own by their irresponsible parents. It really is a horrible situation to be put in. So, the Daily Dose of Stupid, we're going to go ahead and go straight to that.
No, you messed it up. You're stupid.
Today's Daily Dose of Stupid is actually involving a big movie star, Chris Pratt, who, by the way, I'm very excited. I just got the Blu-ray for Avengers Infinity War, so I'll probably be watching that a little bit later today. That was a big Christmas present from my uncle. So Chris Pratt, who is the star, of course, of Guardians of the Galaxy, he's also in Jurassic World. I mean, basically you're living under a rock if you don't know who Chris Pratt is by now. He's on Parks and Rec, all that stuff. So Chris Pratt was ranked the number 5 on list of the best Chris's. I don't know, it just seems kind of weird to make a list based on the people's name, but nonetheless. So there was an article in TV Guide titled How to Love Chris Pratt Without Hating Yourself. And here's the issue that it really revolves around. Chris Pratt is a very outspoken Christian. He tends to have more conservative values. I don't think that the guy's some dyed-in-the-wool conservative or anything like that. I'm just saying that he seems to have some conservative values. He's a hunter. He raises his own lambs. And he does seem to like talking about religion and talking about the gospel a lot more than your average celebrity, for sure. And I really like him, not just because of that. I thought he was funny before I even knew any of that about him. And so a really, really interesting guy and somebody that is very, very talented. So in this TV Guide article, there's a couple things I wanted to point out that there was an assumption that fans are really worried about the guy's personal beliefs, which maybe it's just being a conservative to where the vast, vast majority of actors and musicians and that kind of thing are very liberal. I just don't see that as being a big deal. I can appreciate somebody's performance, their artistic ability, without necessarily getting into the weeds of whether or not I agree with their politics. In fact, a lot of the celebrities I like, probably very, very far left. I mean, I tend to really like guys like Tom Hanks. I think he's a great actor. If you're looking past Chris Pratt, the other Avengers, guys like Chris Hemsworth, Chris Evans, a lot of guys named Chris on the Avengers, come to think of it. Interesting. But nonetheless, I really like, Tobey Maguire. There's several actors that I would say would be my A-list that are probably ridiculously far to the left. I have the ability, and I think that most Americans have the ability, to separate out whether or not they like the guy's performance, like him as an actor or a comedian or a musician, without necessarily saying that you like the guy's personality, you like the guy as a personal, whether you're talking about politics, whether you're talking about his religion or belief system, most Americans can look at somebody and say, he's a really good actor, without getting all bent out of shape of the fact, well, but he doesn't agree with me politically very much. See, they're assuming here that that's very, very difficult for somebody to be a fan of someone and also disagree with their personal beliefs. I don't see that as being much of an issue at all. And another thing too, that really I think we've kind of buried the lead here on tactics. Who knew TV Guide still existed? Like, seriously, I was reading this last night. I was just sitting there scratching my head thinking, wait, you mean there's still a TV Guide? I thought the TV Guide went out with the advent of menus on your satellite or cable. I thought that was the whole point of that, is that you didn't have to have this actual paper guide to what was going to be on television. I mean, seriously, I didn't know that TV Guide still existed. I figured that it still existed as an organization or something, but I really didn't think that they still put out a magazine with actual articles in it. I mean, even when TV Guide was at its peak, even before satellite came in and cable still, you had to flip through the channels just like on your regular TV. Even back then, I don't think anyone was actually buying TV Guide for the articles in it. Pretty sure they were just buying it so they knew what time Matlock came on. I mean, I seriously had no idea that people were actually buying TV Guide. The only person I think that actually read the articles would be Frank Costanza. You remember that episode of Seinfeld where he's very upset that Elaine's friend has taken all of his TV guides. But nonetheless, I think they're taking themselves a little too seriously, and maybe when you're really floundering as a business, you have to say something ridiculous and stupid just to make a splash and to get some attention. So Caitlin Thomas, who is a senior editor for TV Guide, wrote this in her article. It's impossible to ignore some problematic aspects of his life off-screen. Adding fuel to this particular fire is the fact that Pratt, an avid hunter who has often spoke about his love for hunting, currently raises lambs on his farm. The enthusiastic tone he took when speaking about eating fresh farm-to-table lamb in an Instagram video earlier this year. They are the happiest lambs on the planet. They are so sweet, and then one day they wake up dead and they're in my freezer, sparked backlash from a number of fans, and not just those that are vegetarians or vegans. The next day, Pratt posted a photo of several pieces of fresh lamb meat and even compared said lamb's death to something as easy or trivial as unplugging a TV. So basically what that is saying is that he's problematic, to use her word, because he's not a left-wing nut job. That's essentially what she's saying. If he were just a normal left-wing nut job that was so terribly concerned with every little thing coming out of his mouth being 100% PC approved, then he wouldn't be a problem. But the reason he's problematic is because he's funny and he shows some common sense, and he doesn't kowtow to every liberal interest group. That's the reason that he's problematic, according to this woman. And here's the thing about the meat thing, whether it's him being a hunter or talking about the fact that he kills his own lambs and eats them. Isn't that way more honest than most of these celebrities that kind of give lip service to it? Because there's a few celebrities that are vegans or vegetarians or whatever, but most of them aren't. And so where do they think the meat that they eat comes from? Do they think it comes from the magic meat fairy that makes it appear in the grocery store? I mean, whether Chris Hemsworth is the one killing the lamb and eating it and cooking it himself, or it's some celebrity that goes to a 5-star restaurant and eats the lamb, the point is, a lamb still died. And somebody still slaughtered it, and they still cooked it, and then it still wound up on their table, and they were the ones still eating it. So the fact that you think that that's any different than Chris Pratt, I almost said Chris Hemsworth. You think that's any different than Chris Pratt raising his own lambs and killing it himself and then cooking it himself, to think that that is any different than what you're doing is completely hypocritical. Just because you may not see the actual animal die doesn't mean the animal didn't die. And that's what's so ridiculous about this whole thing. And being an ag guy, maybe it's just because I've done this for a really long time. I've slaughtered my own animals. I've raised animals that I later ate. It just doesn't bother me. But some people seem to think that it's horribly wrong for you to eat an animal that you raised, but there's absolutely nothing wrong with eating an animal that somebody else raised. Why? What's the difference? It doesn't make any sense. And frankly, it's far more honest, and it seems like Chris Pratt is far more aware and has an appreciation for his food that those people don't. Because when you grow it yourself, when you realize that for you to survive and for you to get sustenance and for you to eat meat, that there had to be an animal that died and gave its life in that process, you have a greater appreciation for your food, and you have much more of a connection to it. And so because of that, and realizing that and being aware of that, actually makes you far more sympathetic and makes you far more aware of what's going on. You're far more aware of the fact that something died when you're the one that actually killed it, as opposed to it just showing up on your plate at a restaurant. I mean, that's simply the way that it is. And if you've ever posted pictures of your food on social media, so you get a nice steak and you take a picture of it and you put it on Instagram, which a lot of celebrities do. Well, then how is that any better than Chris Pratt taking pictures on his Instagram of meat that he put in his freezer? What's the difference? Just because it happens to be raw. The drawing of moral false equivalencies here is just ridiculous. There's a very healthy dose of double standard going on here. And here's another thing to just kind of really emphasize that. In this same TV Guide article, Caitlin Thomas also said, the idea that Pratt doesn't see himself, though many come from the working class family and he spends most of his time on a farm, he also is a successful straight white man at the heart of two major film franchises. As being represented in a television or film is ridiculous, as this idea of a working class American isn't well represented in Hollywood. Okay, so let's unpack this one. So what you're saying is that he paints himself as sort of this blue collar guy, and that he's a hypocrite and he's wrong for doing so because he also happens to be a very successful straight white male. Well, here's the thing. This whole article was done as a part of a series on other people named Chris. Let's look at who the other Chris's are. Chris Evans, in other words, Captain America, Chris Hemsworth, Thor, and Chris Pine and Chris Klein. I don't really know a whole lot about them. I think they're in movies that I don't really see a whole lot of. But nonetheless, aren't they all very successful straight white men? Why don't you point out that they're successful straight white men? This goes back to a problem that the left has with success. Success is only frowned upon, wealth is only frowned upon if you have the wrong ideas. In other words, it's perfectly normal and good to be wealthy, to have a lot of money, to have a lot of privilege, as long as you happen to be a liberal talking point. As long as you happen to agree with everything the left does, they're never going to call you out for your wealth. They're never going to call you out for your privilege. They're never going to call you out for your success. There's a reason that Jeff Bezos seems to get a pass on pretty much everything when it comes to the left, because he also runs the Washington Post. And despite being one of the wealthiest men on earth and running one of the most successful companies on earth, his wealth isn't a bad thing. Look at the Koch brothers, for example, versus Warren Buffett, who the Koch brothers are actually pretty socially liberal. They just happen to be fiscally conservative, and they support a lot of Republican candidates because of that. Even though they're nowhere near the biggest political donors, nor are they anywhere near the wealthiest people on earth, they get all kinds of crap from the left because they happen to have different ideas and different opinions. The reason the left goes after them and not successful people on their side is because wealth is only bad if you happen to be a right-winger. See, Chris Pratt's wealth and success, and the fact that he's not really a blue-collar guy, is only a problem for this woman because he doesn't toe the liberal line on things. But the four other Chris's that have been talked about before, nobody ever talks about them being successful straight white men. Why? Because that's only a problem if you happen to disagree with some things of people on the left. If you happen to be a pop culture hero for the right, then you can say whatever you want to about them. You can lob any kind of criticism that you want to at them at that point. And this double standard is really, really sickening when you get it, because only rich people on the right ever get criticized for stuff like this. Your wealth and your success are never criticized if you happen to be on the left. In fact, the left will cover for you in a lot of ways, and if you don't believe me, Harvey Weinstein. NBC covered for him for years and still wouldn't run Roman Farrow's story when he came to them first about it. So, I mean, if you are on the left, you have cover from the media and from other people that are in those sort of social circles. And when it comes to Chris Pratt, this guy is one of the very few celebrities that at least has some aspects of blue-collar life in his lifestyle. I'm not going to sit here and try to tell you that he's a blue-collar working man just like everybody else. And I'm guessing Chris Pratt probably himself wouldn't tell you that. But he does actually go out and work on a farm on land that he owns and produces some of his own food. Now, the guy's very well-to-do. He lives a very lavish lifestyle, and that is perfectly okay. More power to him. Glad he's so successful. But at the same time, at least there are some aspects of his life that somewhat equate to blue-collar people in middle America. You can't say that for 99% of celebrities. So it seems to me that this woman is doing a ridiculous level of nitpicking here. And at the end of the day, what's so funny about this is this whole thing is just an elaborate way of saying shut up and dribble. You remember how much crap Laura Ingraham caught for telling LeBron James, hey, just shut up and dribble. She was a racist. She hated the fact that he was successful. She was only doing this because he disagreed with her president, which honestly, in Laura Ingram's case, that's probably accurate. But nonetheless, what we're looking at here is the left saying, you know what, just shut up and act. Chris Pratt, just don't tell us about your personal life. Don't tell us about how you happen to like certain conservative ideas. Don't talk to us about your faith. Just shut up and act. Just do your job. Because we want to see you act, but we don't really want to hear about your personal opinion. So just shut up and act. Now, I've always been somebody that, whether it's LeBron James or somebody that I vehemently disagree with, or people that happen to have political affiliations more closely aligned with me, like John Rich or John Voight or Chuck Norris. Regardless of which celebrity it is, they're celebrities. They have free speech in this country. They have a big platform. So if they want to use that platform to promote their political ideas, I don't have a problem with it. I think that from a business standpoint, it's smarter if you don't, because you don't alienate part of your audience. But as far as whether or not they should or shouldn't, look, if you've got a platform, you want to talk about your ideas, that's your business. Same thing with Chris Pratt. Same thing with all the other, Chris Evans, pretty liberal guy. Same thing with Chris Evans, who happens to play Captain America. If you want to have your opinions, you want to put it out there on your platform, hey, that is up to you, man. But when it comes to this, it just bothers me that the left, they want to hear about the left's politics over and over again. They love events like the Oscars. They love all of that stuff where celebrities get together and basically virtue signal about how awesome they are and about leftist politics and leftist talking points. But the second somebody starts giving somewhat of a conservative bend on things, I wouldn't even say, a super conservative bend from Chris Pratt. They're like, you know what? No, shut up and act. It's a complete double standard. They only want people to shut up and act when the person is saying something that they disagree with. And that's really the issue. We need to have a little more consistency. So that being said, let's go ahead and go straight to the Chaplain's Report.
In 1775, the Continental Congress created the Chaplain Corps. Under the command of General George Washington, each soldier was required to attend worship service every Sunday. While other armies advanced on their feet, Washington's troops advanced on their knees. It's time for the Chaplain's Report with Caleb Colquitt on tactics.
Chaplain's Report today, we're going to look in the book of Daniel, and I think that this is especially relevant. We did something with the book of Ruth. You may remember recently we did a series on her and her life and her whole backstory with Naomi and Boaz and how everything worked out. I think I'd really like to do something similar to that, and so today we're going to be starting a series on Daniel. Daniel, of course, being a prophet of God that you can find in the Old Testament, and I highly recommend you, if you're going to be looking at these, read through the whole scripture and read through the book of Daniel. It won't take you very long at all, and you'll get a better idea of where we're going with this. So let's look right now at Daniel 1. So just to set the stage a little bit, Daniel has three friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And he and these three friends have sort of bound together because they are Jews being held captive in Babylon. So Babylon went and they conquered Judea, and they took some of the best looking, the smartest, basically the cream of the crop, the best of the best, and they took them out of Jerusalem and are now preparing some of those young men for service to the king. So they have these teenage boys that they're trying to get ready for a life of servitude in Babylon. And they want these kids to be educated. They want them to be, healthy and everything else. And so part of their policy in this is to not only incorporate Babylonian education into their lives, but they also want to incorporate essentially every aspect of their lifestyle and make it Babylonian and not Jewish. And one of the ways that they do that is they control their diet. So if you are a Jewish person living in Babylon, this becomes a problem because there are certain laws, according to the book of Exodus and Leviticus, there are certain things you're not allowed to eat. And of course, none of this stuff is going to be killed by a rabbi. And so when you're looking at the meat in this place, this is going to be something that you as a Jewish person cannot follow the law of Moses and continue to eat this. And so what happens is you've got these people that are saying, this is the diet you're going to have now. And we're going to see how Daniel and his friends sort of react to this. That just kind of helps you understand where they're coming from. So in Daniel 1, verse 8, but Daniel made up his mind that he would not defile himself with the king's choice food or the wine which he drank. So he sought permission from the commander of the officials that he might not defile himself. So there's a couple things that we really need to unpack there. First of all, this is how Daniel and his company prepared for temptation. Keep in mind, these are not adult men. These are teenage boys, which indicates to me they have a very strong faith-oriented family life. Because without that, there is no way that they came to this conviction. Without having strong parents, people that taught them the law of Moses, taught them how to conduct themselves in public, to conduct themselves with others, there's no way they arrived at this conclusion. I love the word it uses here. I think the King James says purposed in his heart, but it means the same thing. It's just a more elegant way of saying made up his mind. This is how they prepare for temptation. They know temptation is coming. They know it's going to be a problem. So what they do is they prepare ahead of time before the situation arises that they are not going to defile themselves, that they're going to live according to God's law, that they are not going to sin, they are not going to partake of the king's food. And then when that particular situation arises, where the commander says, here, this is going to be what you're going to eat from now on, they all with conviction say, no, we're not going to defile ourselves. That is not what we're going to do. God's law says we're not allowed to eat certain things, and because of that, we intend to follow God's law. Think about how many sins would be staved off completely if more people took the same stance that Daniel and his friends here did. If they decided ahead of time, we are making up our minds now that we will not engage in sinful activity. See, because here's the thing. You never want to have to make a plan on the battlefield as the battle's happening. That's not a good plan. Or if it is a good plan, it was something that was reached in haste, which means that there's probably some blind spots. Whenever you're in a battle, and the Bible very often equates what we're going through with sin and temptation as a spiritual battle against darkness. Whenever you're in a battle, the worst thing you can do is to go in and say, you know what, we'll just wing it. We'll just figure it out as we go along. Not a good idea. Because if you're there in the moment having to make that decision, when the heat is up and the pressure's on, maybe you wind up making a good decision, but odds are you don't. For example, if you are going to a bar and you know that you struggle with alcoholism and that alcohol is a temptation for you, and you know that if you partake of it, you're probably going to get drunk, you don't decide once you get to the bar, okay, I should probably not drink alcohol, because once you're there and your buddies are there and everybody's having a good time, it's really hard to say no then. What you want to do is you want to make up your mind ahead of time to either not go to the bar at all, which would probably be the best idea, or you make up your mind ahead of time, if I'm going to be around people that are going to be drinking, like at a Christmas party or something, you make up your mind ahead of time, I'm not going to engage in that activity. Because if you start trying to make up your mind while you're there, then it becomes a lot more problematic. Then you're a lot more likely to say, yeah, I'll go ahead and do it. And I also want to talk about their conviction here, because giving in was easily the path of least resistance. That would have been the much easier route for Daniel and his friends to go. Because as human beings, we tend to rationalize things in our own mind. Let's say you're Daniel in this situation. You're a Jewish person. You believe that it's morally wrong to partake of these things, to defy the law of Moses. You're thinking, well, yeah, but we've been taken captive, and he's the king, and if we refuse, he could kill us, which he could have done. And yet, Daniel and his friends, knowing that's a possibility, sit down and say, doesn't matter. Doesn't matter, we're doing what God says. Yeah, it puts us in danger. Yeah, we may have to face some consequences for this. We may have to suffer from persecution, but you know what? Doing God's will is that important to us. Doing what God told us to do is just that important to us, that we're willing to risk that. You've got to admire that kind of conviction. And it's the same kind of conviction that we as Christians are called to have. That God knows situations are going to show up where it would be easy to justify in our own mind or from our human perspective why we need to go ahead and make an exception. Why we need to go ahead and defy God's law just this once, or maybe just these few times. But when it's all said and done, at the end of the day, what we're supposed to do is exactly what Daniel and his friends did, which is do the right thing, follow God's law, and have faith that he's going to work it all out. That he will provide a way for us to be in accordance to his law and to continue to be in his good favor. Now, that may mean something pretty severe. For all we know, that may mean even our death in some cases, in the most extreme cases. But nonetheless, if we have faith that God is going to be there, he's going to take care of us, then even death is a consequence that we should be able to accept. If it's between death and defying God's law, we should be the kind of people that have the conviction like Daniel and his friends that go with, you know what, we'll take death over defying God's law. That's okay with us. So this is a kind of conviction that you have to greatly admire, especially in young people like this. You never want to get in the mentality of, oh, God's going to understand. God will understand me missing church this one time. God will understand me, well, just having some social drinks and only getting drunk in that context. God will understand me using foul language this one time. God will understand me getting rough with my wife. I mean, he would understand that situation. No. God gives us specific commands for a reason. And when it comes to treating our brothers and sisters the way that we ought to and helping them, God's not going to understand us being derelict in our duties and ignoring the teachings of Christ when it comes to that. Because God understands better than anybody that humans, by our very nature, are frail, weak creatures. And to stand against the darkness, to stand against sin and temptation, we have to do what Daniel did and prepare ahead of time and set our minds in such a way ahead of time that we are already convinced we will not enter into that sin. We have to make a plan, dedicate ourselves to that plan, and have the moral, righteous conviction to make sure that we are in compliance with God's law in all things, just like he did. Stay the course, friends.